Okay, well, welcome everybody to the UKCCSRC virtual conference. And as it says on the title page, the theme is delivering on COP26, CCS across the world. And we're going to look a little bit at COP26, but a lot more at CCS across the world. And in fact, I'm going to start out talking about COP26 because I think it's important to put carbon capture and storage globally in perspective. We're going to hear a lot about where we're going from all of our speakers, but I think it's also a little bit useful to think where we've come from. Next slide, please. The UN Climate Change Conference UK 2021, COP26. What's it about? Well, the climate mitigation goal is to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. So very clear goals. And countries are being asked to come forward with 2030 targets that align with meeting net zero by the middle of the century. So we need big cuts by 2030. And if you have a look at the methods that are being talked about to deliver on these targets, it's accelerate the phase out of coal, cut deforestation, speed up the switch to electric vehicles, and encourage investment in renewables. So nothing about carbon capture and storage there. But then if you look down on UK domestic leadership, you don't have to go very far down the different points where the UK is working on tackling climate change to see we were the first major economy to put into law that we will reach net zero emissions by 2050. And if you have a look, the fact that net zero is there implies that you will do a lot of carbon capture and storage. Next slide, please. So this is the Committee on Climate Change, which is, if you like, the guardian of the UK's CCS activities, net zero activities, looking at how you achieve net zero in the report in May 2019. And as they say, if you're going to get to net zero, CCS is a necessity, not an option. The 2050 scenarios for net zero involve somewhere between 75 and 175 million tons of CO2 captured and stored per year, and then 5 clusters and CO2 transported from elsewhere to those clusters by ships and heavy good vehicles. And then the range of measures that they can see easily get to about 95 to 96% reduction. And to get the last bit, you're looking at some as yet undeveloped technologies, so shifts in diet, land use, bans on flying, direct air capture or other greenhouse gas removal technologies, or major development of synthetic fuel. So again, a big role to get to actual net zero. And I like to say CCS is what puts the net in net zero. Next slide, please. So if CCS is so important, why isn't it there in COP26? Well, CCS actually really came to world attention at the Gleneagles conference, which the UK also led. We were chair of the EU and also chair of the G8 at the time, and a major conference looking at climate change. And one of the points in the communique was we will work to accelerate the development and commercialization of carbon capture and storage technology. So it's really, if you like, fired the starting pistol on the race to get CCS going. So how do we get on? Let's have a look at some slides. So announced actually just before Gleneagles at the preceding scientific conference was a project in Scotland, not very far from the site of the conference at Peterhead, to build essentially a separate natural gas to hydrogen to electricity power plant and to send the CO2 offshore through an existing pipeline to an oil field. It was announced, as I say, in mid-2005, but there was no particular clear funding route for it, and the need for the technology in the UK had moved on to coal actually by the time the project was cancelled in 2007. So quite a serious project. I think it would have worked, but it didn't go ahead. Next slide, please. So the reason that Peterhead wasn't so attractive was that the UK at the time was looking for a big coal build program because of high natural gas prices. And we were talking about building, I don't know, 10 gigawatts of new coal plants. This was the first one of them, Kings North. And as you can see at the bottom of the picture, it was going to have post-combustion capture to at least bring it down to the level of emissions of natural gas. But we had the recession, we had shale gas in the US, and global expectations for natural gas prices at the time dropped. And it was announced that Kings North, the new coal plant, wasn't going to be built, and E.ON withdrew this CCS project from the competition to build CCS projects in the UK in 2010. Next slide, please. Another project, also in Scotland at Longannet, the coal plant, was built, but then again cancelled in 2011. So the project went all the way to FEED, looking at a 300 megawatt plant retrofitted onto the existing coal plant, but again was cancelled. Next slide, please. Just to show how serious the UK was, though, this wasn't playing around. In the Energy Act of 2010, a bill was rushed through just before the 2010 general election with broad support that introduced a CCS levy of up to £11 billion on electricity to fund all types of power plants. But we had the recession immediately afterwards, and a lot of new build was actually stopped. Next slide, please. However, we did, after that, start up with a second competition, looking at building relatively small demonstration projects. This was one of them that was proposed, again went all the way to FEED, an oxy-fuel coal-fired power plant on the Drax site in Yorkshire. Next slide, please. And the other one going back to Peterhead, this time not a new hydrogen power plant, but a post-combustion capture retrofit on the existing coal-fired power plant. Both of these projects, again, went to FEED, but were cancelled essentially due to lack of perceived value by the Treasury at the end of 2015. So a few tries in the UK, but no immediate success. Next slide, please. However, this is the latest announcement, November 2020. We've got a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, and two of those points are hydrogen, 5 gigawatts by 2030, and carbon capture and storage, 10 megatons by 2030. So we're looking to have 2 carbon clusters by the mid-2020s, another 2 by 2030. So this is where the UK is at the moment, recognising the importance of developing it. But you can see that those targets for 2030 are not going to make the hundreds of millions of tonnes of CO2 reduction that are needed to meet the COP26 targets. Next slide, please. We did see some successes over the last decades. This is Boundary Dam, the first power plant, opened in October 2014 in Saskatchewan in Canada. So that's still running. Next slide, please. And some successes. This is a presentation given in 2014 by Wilfred Mass from Shell. You can see the ticks on Test Centre Mongstad, Quest, another project in Canada, and Gorgon, another project in Australia, which is still working, but a number of projects that didn't work. Barendrecht in the Netherlands, Draugen in Norway, and Peterhead, as we've also discussed. Next slide, please. This is one of the projects that really almost made it in the Netherlands, Maasvlakte and Road, looking at retrofitting partial capture on a coal-fired power plant, but overtaken because coal-fired power plants just weren't deemed politically acceptable in the Netherlands. So the plant was going to be closed, so no point in doing the CCS project, although a lot of the learnings have carried on. Next slide, please. US, similar story. This is, again, a presentation from 2014. A number of projects. The ones that worked are in red, with red outline, and the ones that didn't work are in black. So what about the ones that worked? Go on, please. So Illinois Industrial Carbon Capture and Storage Project, capturing CO2 from an ethanol plant, injected over 1 million tons of CO2 in a saline aquifer. Next slide, please. Air Products Project at Port Arthur, capturing CO2 from a methane reformer. Again, very successful, captured 6 million tons to date, slightly more than that. Next slide, please. And Petronova, the second power plant project, again, a retrofit on an existing coal plant. Worked successfully for a period, but it's shut down in mid-2020 and currently isn't operating with the low price of oil and the recession blamed for the shutdown. Next slide, please. So just to finish up on a happier note, perhaps, go to Norway. The Sleipner project started in 1996. This must be one of the oldest graphics on CCS that you can get, from 2002, showing the Sleipner platform and the reinjection of CO2 in the Sierra Formation. So that's been working now for over 20 years, incredibly long time. Next slide, please. But there was also Norway's famous moon landing, which was going to be post-combustion capture on a gas-fired power plant. And that again went to FEED study, but didn't work because essentially the need for gas-fired power plants in the Norwegian electricity system disappeared. You can, though, find a full FEED study, hundreds of documents for this on the UKCCSRC website. So some of the information's available. Next slide, please. Another success story, though, Snøhvit, capturing CO2 or using the CO2 that has to be taken out before an LNG plant being injected offshore. Again, very successful. Next slide, please. And something that still has to happen, but I'm including it here because it's actually had final investment decision, is the Longship project with the Anchor project, CO2 capture at a cement plant in Norway. So, if you like, we've got a series of successes and a series of failures. CCS hasn't reached scale, but it's very important that it does so to get to net zero. It's absolutely crucial, and it's obvious that if we don't carry on and actually deliver on some of these plans that we're going to hear about over the course of the conference, then we won't be in a position to deliver the hundreds and thousands of million tons of CO2 reduction that we actually need to get to net zero. And CCS will have to go big time, perhaps not this decade, really big time, but certainly in the following decades to get to net zero. Next slide, please. So I'll just leave you with something that I bumped into a couple of COPs ago at Katowice Airport in Poland. As I got off the plane, I was just wandering around trying to get some money, and I saw this GCCSI slide showing Jade Heimeister advertising CCS from the Global CCS Institute with a slogan, which I think is very, very true. We must pursue carbon capture and storage like our lives depend on it, because they do. And I have to say, if not our lives, I think the lives of our children and grandchildren will be significantly impaired if we don't get net zero, and carbon capture and storage is a very big part of that. So enjoy the conference, but it isn't just enjoyable, it is very, very, very important. Thank you. I'll now pass over to Stuart Hazeldine from University of Edinburgh, SCCS and UKCCSRC Deputy Director, to take on the rest of the section. Over to you, Stuart.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, John, for a very balanced and comprehensive overview of the life and times of large-scale carbon capture and storage. So as John said, we're still, it can be viewed as very positive because 30–40% of projects has worked, but can be viewed as very negative depending on which side of the green divide you're on. But again, as the Committee on Climate Change has maybe lived to regret, CCS is not an option but essential. And one way of delivering CCS is by is by government subsidy and detailed government intervention, which is what we're plodding through again in the UK. But there are other ways of thinking about the necessity for carbon capture and storage and how that might be delivered. And our next speakers are going to present that, Myles Allen and Stuart Jenkins from the University of Oxford. Myles Allen will come on briefly in a minute to talk about the setting of this. Myles is a physicist by origin, a long-term climate modeler in the Department of Physics, and is a serial IPCC author and interventionist, so he's never learned his lesson yet. And Stuart is studied a master's in physics at Oxford last year and developed a all-consuming hobby in modeling research of the emissions pathways fitted to the integrated assessment models. So Stuart will present the talk in a moment, but I'll hand over to Myles to do a short introduction before Myles goes back to his sick bed. Over to you, Myles.
Thank you very much to Jonathan for giving us the opportunity to present this, and I'm very grateful to Stuart Jenkins to take us through the carbon takeback obligation idea. If I might just give a little bit of background to this in the context of Jon's presentation. I think, Jon does his best to sort of give a glass half full presentation of the situation, but I do think we do need to look at what we're doing and ask ourselves, after 15 years of effort or something, what are we doing wrong? We shouldn't just keep banging our heads against the same wall in the hope of a different result. And one of the, as Jon pointed out, and Stuart, one of the universal characteristics of all of those CCS projects is they were funded by the taxpayer. So when finally it came down to it, the taxpayer basically jibbed at the final fence because it was such a lot of money to hand over to the fossil fuel industry, and it was very easy for the environmental movement to say, this is just a subsidy to the fossil fuel industry. So ever since 2009, we've been arguing for actually requiring CCS as an obligation on the fossil fuel industry. And one of the great disappointments of the past 10 years for me has been the lack of uptake of this suggestion by the international CCS association. So Jon pointed out that that advert from the Global CCS Institute, that they're saying our lives depend on CCS. Well, why aren't they advocating for it to be a requirement, a legal requirement? If you're going to pull fossil fuels out of the ground, you've got to start putting the CO2 back. And this is what we've been arguing for 10 years. But until recently, there's always been a counter argument from economists, if you like, to say that, well, it's a regulation you're proposing. Regulations are not as good as carbon taxes, which are sort of theoretically optimal, and therefore it'll cost more, so we don't want to talk about it. And this was actually why this idea was thrown out when it got closest, I think, to enactment in the 2015 Energy Bill in the UK. The civil service all looked at it and said, this is going to affect our competitiveness. No, we don't like it. Let's get rid of it. So Stuart Jenkins, although Stuart Hazelden was also involved in this work with Eli Mitchell-Larsen and Matt Ives, has done a huge amount of work over the past couple of years addressing this question head on. Is a carbon takeback obligation, this notion of, by the way, that's Margaret Cowper's name for it, I should say, but it's a very good name, because it's basically the idea is you just give the CO2 back to the company providing you with fossil fuels and tell them to get rid of it, just like applying extended producer responsibility to somebody selling you a fridge in complex packaging. Stuart's been looking at the actual economic implications of this using global integrated assessment models. So over to you, Stuart.
Great. Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see my slides, so I will get started. So the starting point for the story is the need for geological CO2 storage to meet the Paris goals, which we've kind of briefly touched on, but just to illustrate this point with a figure. The blue line on this figure shows the annual CO2 emissions time series produced if you average over all of the technology neutral scenarios that were deemed to achieve 1.5 degrees in the IPCC's special report on the global warming of 1.5 degrees. So if you exclude scenarios that have some particular transformation built into them in terms of societal transformation and technological advancement that would mean that we don't need CO2 sequestration and just use all of the technology neutral scenarios, then this is what you find. You find that 2/3 of your mitigation effort can arrive because you transition to requiring less CO2 production. So that's through, for example, here, clean energy transitions, but there is a huge chunk of mitigation that is missing, and that effort comes through assumed CO2 capture, transport, and ultimately geological carbon storage. And therefore, this is something that is necessary. And the reason that we exclude the technology, the scenarios which are deemed to be not requiring of CCS in this case, are because they tend to require some not very well cost estimated revolution in terms of technologies that will enable us to not use CO2 in the mid-century, et cetera, et cetera. So if we require this quantity of CCS in the mid-century, then why is it starved of investment? Well, here is a figure which kind of illustrates why that is at present day, produced in a recent report by Goldman Sachs, which was looking at the economy and interactions with climate change, and in particular CCS investment in this case. And it shows the carbon abatement cost per ton of CO2 that you abate on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, then you have the mitigation, the abatement potential of that action. And you can see that for the vast majority of the cost curve, it's the measures which reduce CO2 pollution which are cheaper. And you only get a crossover where your CCS activity is cheaper than reducing production after you've reduced about 75% of your emissions, which is a problem because it means that for 75% of the time and for the vast majority of your mitigation effort, there's no incentive to begin investment in CO2 storage capacity increases. So this potentially traps us in a situation in the mid-century where we all of a sudden require vast quantities of CO2 storage, but we fail to invest in it adequately in the decades coming. So here is where a carbon takeback obligation comes in our eyes, and it's something that can be used to target that kind of gap in policy. So imagine that you group together a number of countries, for example, let's call them the North Sea Alliance, and you impose a licensing condition on those nations such that selling fossil fuels, any company that sells fossil fuels in that group of countries must certify that a fraction of the CO2 in those fuels is being recaptured and geologically sequestered. So that is a very general requirement. So you're not requiring the CO2 to be recaptured from that particular source of CO2. It can be sequestered from any source in which you would otherwise have ended up with CO2 being dumped into the atmosphere. So to start with, that means that companies will probably target their own emissions, or at least point source industrial emissions, because they will be the cheapest, highest concentrated sources to target for sequestration. But ultimately, you'll have to transition to including free air capture in that, and obviously, therefore, there's a sliding scale of cost. But that only is realized in the mid-century when you require the free air capture to reach 100% sequestration. So yeah, that sequestration fraction rises on average here by 3% or so a year, but it starts very slowly. So in the 2020s, then you're rising from say 1% in 2020 through to 10% in 2030. In 2040, you're achieving 50% sequestered fraction, and by 100%, by 2050, you're reaching 100%. So your net zero date is defined in policy in 2050, and you have this sliding scale of sequestration, of the obligation to sequester before that. you can imagine that this has quite a high cost attached to it, at least in the mid-century, where you're requiring direct air capture of any CO2 you release. And that cost will be passed on to the consumer, which acts like any kind of carbon price, encouraging a shift away from the fossil fuel itself because it now costs more to use it. But importantly, it doesn't require any sort of either ban on the use of fossil fuels or a punitive carbon tax. It's purely done by the costs of the obligation, the CTBO, being passed on to the consumer. So now that we've got an approximate idea of what the CTBO is going to be targeting, how much will it cost? So here is another figure from that Goldman Sachs report, which looked at the CO2 capture potential and the cost per capture potential for a range of CCS activities, carbon capture opportunities. Beginning at the lowest end of the cost curve, you have natural sinks, some of which aren't appropriate necessarily for the type of CTBO that we'd be advocating for, because you need timescales of storage which are comparable to the mechanisms, to the storage of the CO2 that you're pulling it from. So in the case of fossil fuel storage, forestry, afforestation schemes aren't necessarily appropriate locations of storage, but certainly CCS activity in natural gas processing, for example, or fertilizer and chemicals production, CCS, are appropriate sources of carbon capture and storage that you can then use. So that's at the bottom end of our cost curve. And then through the middle of the cost curve, you have these industrial sources, which are, as it says at the top here, just inversely proportional. The costs are inversely proportional to the concentration of the stream of CO2 that you're capturing from. So while you have an industrial point source which has a high concentration, then you have a reasonably cheap source of sequestration opportunity. But at the other end of the scale, where you have quite diffuse sources, then it gets more expensive. And then finally, at the end of the cost curve, you have this direct air capture block, which kind of fades off to infinity in the case of this figure, suggesting that there's potentially a large quantity of scalable CCS that can take place here at the highest costs realized by having to capture from the most diffuse source of CO2 that we have, which is just direct capture from the air. And the cost range implied here is $150 to $400 per ton of CO2. So we have this cost curve which kind of encompasses somewhere around $50 per ton CO2 at the bottom, rising through to $250 per ton CO2 captured and stored at the top end. So if we just use those as two kind of pinning points for our assumed CO2 disposal costs, $50 at the lower end, where we're capturing from concentrated point sources, $250 at the high end, where we're reaching net zero policy and we're requiring direct air capture, then we can work out approximately under our CTBO what that cost implies for the cost per fossil carbon unit sold, which is just going to be equal to the cost of the storage if we assume that the price of the storage rises linearly with the obligation, the fraction that you're required to recapture and store. So if you're requiring a small sequestered fraction S, then that cost is going to be closer to your industrial point source cost. And if you're requiring 100% sequestration, you're more likely to have realized the entire cost. And then because this is the cost of storage per unit, per ton stored, we multiply that again by another S to get that in the cost per ton of fossil carbon sold in the market. So say we only have to we only require 15% of the carbon within a fossil fuel source to be stored, then you're only going to realize 15% of that storage cost for each ton sold. So just kind of ballpark estimates of the consumer carbon price equivalent for those carbon prices. We begin in the early 2020s with a very small sequestered fraction requirement, and that has equally very small carbon prices. So you're talking kind of 50 cents per ton of CO2. And then as this rises, so say we're at 15% somewhere in the early 2030s, then our cost per ton CO2 sold in the marketplace is $12 per ton CO2 sold. And then ultimately in 2050, when we reach 100% sequestration, then that is you realize the full air capture cost. So you can see how this would act like a consumer carbon price and rise through the 21st century as the obligation to store a higher and higher percentage of the carbon in the product rises. That is the kind of basis of the CTBO, and that is the approximate economics of how you would go about discharging that kind of policy. But how do we understand how it actually interacts in a global setting? Well, we have tried to do that using an integrated assessment model, and we use an emulator for an integrated assessment model in which we can plug in our CTBO policy and understand how it reacts and compare it to traditional policies which are driven by carbon pricing. So in this figure and in the figures following it, I have a series of colored lines. So the dark blue lines are the 1.5 degree scenarios characterized in integrated assessment models using a carbon price, exponentially rising carbon price. The light blue models are the same thing. So integrated assessment model output, which are deemed to be 2 degree consistent using an exponentially increasing carbon price. The gray line at the top is our baseline policy, where we assume no increased ambition from present day climate policy. And then finally, we have these two policies, which are variations on a CTBO. So for now, we'll focus on just just applying a CTBO at a global level, which is the red policy. And we'll come back to what the yellow policy means in a little bit. But you can see that the end goal of this policy is to achieve a net zero date in the mid-century, which we achieve here in 2050 using the CTBO, beginning in 2020 with a baseline policy. And there's some transition that takes place that aligns with the increase in the sequestered fraction requirement under our CTBO. So how does this actually get implemented? Well, if we look at the integrated assessment model output that just use a carbon price to achieve mitigation, then they begin with a very low stored fraction in the 2020s. But as you'd expect for any of these scenarios that are going to achieve net zero emissions in the mid-century, by a result of the policies that they implement, by a result of the carbon pricing that they implement, they have a rising stored fraction, which ultimately reaches 100% somewhere in the mid-century as well. It's just that their stored fraction shape is a result of the policy that they implement. And under the CTBO, the switch around is that instead of this curve becoming an output of the policy that you implement, the policy begins by mandating this storage requirement. This stored fraction shape is going to be quadratic and is going to rise from 0 in 2020 to 100% in 2050. And then after doing that, then you work out the implications for the produced CO2 based on the estimated costs to achieve this CTBO. So that's the kind of switch around that we're doing here in the integrated assessment model setup. So having mandated this CTBO mandates this stored fraction shape, which rises from 0 through roughly 10% in 2030, 40 or 50% in 2040, and 100% in 2050. That, because of the costs which will be applied to the fossil fuel sellers in the marketplace and ultimately passed on to the consumer, that results in reduced CO2 production, just as it would if you were to apply it as a carbon price. But because of the way that we've shaped our obligation to store, initially, there's not much impetus to drive a reduction in CO2 production. So you can see in the 2030s here, between 2020 and probably around 2035, there's reasonably little difference in our carbon takeback policy from what you would observe under the baseline policy. And that's simply because initially this obligation to store is just too cheap. It's kind of cents up to a few dollars per ton CO2 stored. And so there's not much impetus in the marketplace to drive that reduction in CO2 production. after around 2035, you do get a reduction in CO2 production, and that's just because you're beginning to realize more and more diffuse sources of CO2 capture until the mid-century, where you're realizing the cost of direct air capture. And at that point, you're approximately aligned with the ambition of the carbon price driven scenarios, as you'd expect to be. But that's why you see this kind of slow uptake on the CO2 production reductions in the case of purely applying a CTBO. That results because of the way that you apply your CTBO. You apply it on the production curve. So if you have this production curve that looks like this, then the mandated storage requirements will be 10% of this CO2 that's being produced must be stored in 2030. In 2040, approximately 50% of this CO2 produced will be stored. And in 2050, 100% of this CO2 will be stored. So that results in an obligation to store that looks like this in the case of the pure CTBO policy, which is a very large storage requirement to achieve net zero by mid-century. But importantly, we haven't restricted the quantity of CCS that we can, the build rate of CCS that the model is going to achieve between now and mid-century. And that's because the CTBO is specifically targeting CCS capacity increases. And so under such a policy, we envisage that increased build rates from what's restricted within integrated assessment models might be plausible. Importantly as well, the CTBO isn't designed to work in isolation. It's not a policy which you would envisage applying on the marketplace with no additional measure. It's more to be thought of as a backstop measure, such that in the mid-century, if you're releasing CO2, you're guaranteed to have a system in which it will be recaptured and stored safely, thus contributing to meeting the 1.5 degree goal. So in yellow, what we've done is we've supplemented the CTBO policy with an additional constant carbon price. And we've chosen that carbon price to target mitigation effort in the initial part of this curve where the CTBO was slow to begin reducing CO2 emissions. So initially it's the carbon price, the demand side driven carbon pricing, which is reducing CO2 emissions, and then eventually the CTBO stored fraction requirement is high enough that starts to bite, and ultimately it's the combination of those two efforts which brings emissions in line with the 1.5 degree goal. So if we just compare the cost of those two policies, the yellow CTBO supplemented with an additional carbon price and the global CTBO applied on its own, you can see why the yellow policy is targeted more like a 1.5 degree policy. It's because while the red policy begins very small in cost because of the small requirements of storage, the CTBO with additional constant carbon pricing has been supplemented, and so you get it more in line with the estimated carbon prices required from integrated assessment models in the early part of the 21st century. Note that after the net zero date in 2050, the two CTBO policies remain approximately stable around the cost of direct air capture, and that's because we're assuming that the equivalent carbon price realized by the consumer won't rise above the cost of direct air capture, and that's because the direct air capture should represent the highest cost to the consumer if enough capacity is built into the system to ensure that you don't get constraints on the capacity to use CCS. But that's not the case in integrated assessment models, and you can see that for a number of integrated assessment models, they're continuing to rise exponentially well above the cost of direct air capture within these models. So the question is, why do they do this? And while they're doing this, they're often reaching net zero scenarios at prices of around $1,000 per ton CO2. So approximately 2 to 3 times the cost of assumed direct air capture within an integrated assessment model setting. And the reason for this is that CCS deployment rates are limited within integrated assessment models. They're limited by hard constraints, which are reasonably independent of carbon price. So the CTBO can improve on can reduce the cost of a policy simply by trying to break through some of those hard constraints by creating a policy which incentivizes early investment in CCS. So the main take home is that introducing a CTBO now will reduce the risk of these non-economic constraints delaying CCS deployment. And it does that because prohibitively high carbon prices would be needed to achieve net zero if you rely on the market to choose when it's going to invest in CCS, because it will only do so after 75% of the mitigation efforts already taken place. At that point, it's too late to achieve the required build rate for the CCS capacity we're going to need in the mid-century. And that has consequences on the likely failure of meeting our climate goals. So introducing a CTBO now will target early investment in CCS and reduce that risk. An upstream regulatory measure to decarbonise fossil fuels by 2050 is an essential backstop to demand-side measures. It's not something that we're trying to implement instead of demand-side policy. Actually, they work hand in hand, and they can work very well together. If you employ a CTBO as a backstop policy on the supply side of fossil fuels, implementing demand-side carbon pricing can actually produce policy which achieves the Paris climate goals at no significant additional cost. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening. And are there any quick questions?
That's great, Stuart. Thank you very much indeed, and on time. So if Yuho is listening, we'll just take a few questions for Stuart and Myles, the ghostly Myles, if he's there or not. Can I ask, though, Stuart, then, do you model a particular short duration immediate carbon price on the yellow curves to encourage that take up?
Yes. So we just use a constant carbon price, and it is set at the average carbon price required in integrated assessment models in 2020. So it's the initial carbon price, which is set in 2020 across a range of 1.5 degree compatible scenarios in integrated assessment models.
So can you recall what number of carbon price that is? Is that like $20 or $150 or?
It's approximately $110 per ton of CO2.
Yeah. Okay.
But crucially, unlike in all the 1.5 degree scenarios, it doesn't increase exponentially. Yeah. So you don't have that exponential increase to $1,000. Excuse me. $1,000 per ton of CO2 by 2050. And there must be people listening to this who have the ear of the global CCSI. And I would love to know, why is the global CCSI not advocating for this?
And I think that's an interesting question, because I've also totally independently talked to people in the Global CCS Institute who profess to be economists, but are entirely convinced that, let's say, a charge on demand or a charge on emissions is the way to go forward. But I think we group on this presentation can see that charge on emissions has to rise to many hundreds and even many thousands of dollars per ton before you drive out all the emissions you need to drive out. So running the policy forward doesn't seem to work.
Can I just address Ben's question, sure. The ceteris paribus question? There's no draw, crucially, there is no draw on government resources other than monitoring and verification under this policy. It's a regulation on the industry, that the industry is free to pass the cost on to its customers, but it is not a tax. It is not a subsidy. That's what's completely different about this policy from just about every other policy out there. I hope that addresses your question, Ben. So the ceteris paribus assumption is there isn't one, because we don't make a demand on government resources other than monitoring and verification. Obviously in the emulating the impact of this policy on the world economy, which is what Stuart's been doing, the ceteris paribus assumption there is that the demand for CO2 production, that is the demand for activities that produce CO2, responds identically to price, whether or not that price is levied by the government or through a carbon pricing regime, or levied by a requirement on the industry to dispose of CO2. But crucially, we also have to take into account the fact that this is a impact on demand of a change in price, and the economic impact of that change in price. That's not the same as the just adding up the costs, because obviously the money has to go somewhere. I'm going to plead COVID at this point. That wasn't a very good explanation. Maybe Stuart can have another go. But we have we're happy to send you the paper, and we have done our best to model the impact of this policy within the global economy, accounting for where money goes. We're not just sort of siphoning money off and assuming it disappears, if that's what you're concerned about.
So I'm going to try drawing this chat to a close, questions to a close.
And that's probably very sensible, Stuart. I don't think I'm going to say
anything. Answer the anonymous attendee in Q&A. Other policies similar worldwide is, as far as I'm aware, that the Netherlands is having a really serious discussion about how to go towards net zero, and the Netherlands is extremely seriously considering simulating and evaluating exactly this policy to try and enable some continuation of hydrocarbon production, a soft off-ramp, but also a guaranteed 2050 arrival. Okay, so thanks Stuart, and thanks Myles for his fading Oxford demon. You need to go away and recharge your spirit energy, I think.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks again to Stuart for stepping in.
And Stuart will stick on till 12 o'clock. We'll have another question and answer session once we've gone through the next 4 talks here. So hopefully Stuart can hang out for that, and Myles can be horizontal.